Welcome, everyone, to Reimagining Healthcare. It's a new dialogue between risk and patient safety leaders presented by Medplace. We're excited to bring you conversations with top risk and patient safety thought leaders from organizations across the country. Please subscribe to get the latest news and content. And if you find this valuable, this episode, please share it with your colleagues. We're trying to create meaningful dialogues here in your community and others. And if you're interested in participating as a guest, please email us anytime at speakers@medplace.com. I'm Jerrod Bailey. I'm the CEO of Medplace. I'll be playing host today. And today I'm joined by Dr. Husam Bader, assistant professor at Rutgers University and internal medicine faculty at Monmouth Medical Center in Long Branch, New Jersey. Dr. Bader recently published an article, very topical for us, titled Clinical Peer Review, a mandatory process with potential inherent bias in desperate need of reform. That is quite the title, Dr. Bader. Welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Jerrod. Thank you for having me.
I have to say, we deal with this a lot here at Medplace. The companies that approach us to do things around peer review are sort of already recognized some of the things that you brought up in this article, and so really appreciate you joining us and helping us kind of unpack, what is, what's working, what isn't working, what's current problems, and how can we sort of assess the peer review process looking forward? How does peer review 2.0 look to those of us who sort of recognize some of these things that you brought out? So I'll just kind of start there, right? So what is the current state of peer review at most hospitals? Like, what's working, what isn't working, just based on your experience or your research?
Yeah, absolutely, Jerrod. I think what's definitely working for peer review now is we have it in every hospital. It exists
Yeah.
solely because it's a mandatory process. But it's almost like this expensive china every household owns. It's there, it's sitting there, but I'm not sure how much use and benefit we're getting out of it. And that's the depressing part to clinical peer review, is that we absolutely have them. We absolutely have to have them, but it's really not living up to its potential. And that's what got me involved in that process, is we truly need to maximize the benefit of clinical peer review. I think from my own experience, I think the areas where we really lack in clinical peer review are two things, or probably three things. One of them, ironically, is the lack of standardization, because clinical peer review was created to maintain and make sure that the standards of care are met and that the care that patients receive is standardized. But as a process, it is not. It's really very loose, and it's up to the hospital or to the clinical setting to decide how to come up with that process. The other thing that I really felt was a challenge is how passive that process is. A lot of times it does exist. We know it exists, but you don't really hear about it. You don't really get any feedback from it. And in a way, it does feel punitive. And the reason
Yeah.
why I say that, yeah,
No, go ahead. Yeah, that's interesting.
yeah, I think something I found online is while I was doing my manuscript, my article, it seems that 65% of the physicians felt that the clinical peer review process was not helpful. 30% did not know it existed in their hospital. And that's why I call it passive, as it really not it's not out there, it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. And the reason why I call it punitive is when you have any contact with it, it doesn't feel that it's really doing what it's supposed to be doing in root cause analysis or quality improvement, but rather, unfortunately, point fingers to what went wrong and who's at fault, which was never the intent of the process.
Yeah, I mean, it's there to increase the quality of our delivery of care, and when I talk to physicians that are in hospital settings where it's done really well, the culture embraces peer review. It's seen as like we're almost like we're a team, improving ourselves and moving ourselves forward, and there's a really deliberate and obvious data feedback loop that comes back, and it's shared with everyone. And that's like, I've seen it done really, really well. That is definitely the exception to the rule. What you're saying, and we're all human, is if I never get any positive feedback from it, if I don't see the data actually improving any systems, and if I only ever feel it's punitive when it happens at all,
Right.
and that's the majority of our experience, that's a system that really is begging, for some sort of, reformation, right?
100%, Jared. I think what ends up happening is we have two ways of clinical peer review. We have the focused and we have the ongoing peer review. And the focused is obviously when a bad outcome happens and you have to look into it. We're really lacking when it comes to the ongoing, which is evaluating the work without having to have a bad outcome. And this is a really strong source of feedback that doctors can take back, and they can improve on their quality of work. But when it's only happening when a bad outcome happens, that's when it feels punitive. And obviously, doctors will become defensive. They will become just unhappy with the process because they feel like they're being blamed. And I do feel like we've deviated from really the purpose of that
Yeah.
committee, that process.
And I can see why it's a problem, especially when you look at COVID. Everybody has been redlining. Everyone's got more work and more hours than they can, realistically handle. This has all been happening even before COVID. But being proactive just as a day to day, and in taking, doing peer review across everything, not just when bad things happen, takes resources. It takes, to your point earlier, a system and standardization and process and a commitment to it. And it probably also takes a cultural shift,
True,
right? Yeah.
true. Yeah,
And I was going to say, we'll probably get into some potential solutions here in a second too, but
sure.
did you finish your list? I heard kind of three missing things. One was standardization. One was the process being passive and not proactive.
Right. And the last one was how physicians perceive it as punitive
Ah,
rather
yeah,
than a utility of feedback.
yeah,
And yeah, and that really just circles back to how we're using it nowadays.
yeah. Oh, it's
Yeah.
great.
Mm.
So why is this topic even interesting to you? I mean, it sounds like you've been studying it. Where does the
Right.
interest come
Yeah.
from?
And honestly, Jared, it's something that I was thinking about. I do think it's part of this professional maturity that we go through as physicians, because as a medical student, really most of your focus is on the human body, how it works, what can go wrong, how you fix it. But as we evolve, we get more involved in the more realistic aspect of healthcare. You become more familiar with insurance, what insurance can provide and cannot provide, prior authorization, the economical aspect of healthcare, the medical legal aspect. And I think that's was just for me part of this maturity, because a lot of times we'll all encounter doctors being blamed for something that happened, whether it's by a colleague or sometimes even by a nurse. And the process to how evaluate that event is really through clinical peer review. But when you find that process not to be uh, up to par, that's when things get uh, a little difficult.
What
Yeah.
what sorts of things have you seen in your practice, or maybe you've seen other colleagues go through it, that are sort of like obvious disconnects, right? And like we had a conversation before about like just being reviewed by someone who's not at your peer level, and or even a specialist in your
Yeah.
specialty area. Like, what does that look like? Are there other sort of common sort of pitfalls that you see, um,
Right. Right.
hospitals doing?
Yeah, that was like one of the things that not only I saw in real life, but I also found that many physicians agree with it when I was doing my literature review. As I said, Jared, those committees, clinical peer review committees, are available in every hospital because it's a mandate. But when you look into who is actually serving on those committees, a lot of times it's mostly the grand majority are non-physicians, and those are the ones who are evaluating the decision making of the physician. So, for example, when you have a hospitalist and you're looking into an event that happened, but he's being reviewed by a nurse whose expertise is in pediatrics,
Mm.
how much can you really trust that opinion? And when it comes to physicians versus nurses versus physician assistants, everyone really has a strong role in patient care, but the scope of practice, the depth of knowledge is really different. And even for me, Jared, as a physician, as an internal medicine physician, I can't really go and evaluate an OBGYN physician's work. I can't tell you I have enough expertise to judge on the standard of care. It's not that I have no knowledge. I graduated medical school, I rotated through OBGYN, I'm tested on it in exams, but I can't say I can truthfully judge on the standard of care. However, you still see sometimes nurses or physician assistants or nurse practitioners who part of that committee will tell you this is what went wrong. However, they do lack the understanding and the depth of knowledge to evaluate that process.
If
Uh,
that's all in a
yeah.
response to something bad having happened, and
Yeah.
we're already like, on our back heels that this is at best a punitive process, or maybe at worst a punitive process, at best it's a neutral move.
Yeah.
And then, as a physician with years of study and expertise in a certain specialty to sort of be reviewed by someone that isn't at parity with that, I
Yeah.
mean, that's gotta just sort of, be an automatic dysfunctional sort of,
Right.
effort there. So what's it like to be peer reviewed, by a peer? Like how is that received? I'm just curious emotionally if you've gone through both and if it's night and day type of thing.
It's not easy, Jared, to be evaluated or to evaluate a colleague, especially when you are doing it within the same hospital. Because even if I'm evaluating a case, at the end of the day, I know it's probably a colleague who was involved in it. I might not know who exactly that colleague is, but it's going to be someone that I work with, that I see every day. And that gets tricky because you always want to give an unbiased opinion. But if you know it's someone you're likely close with or a colleague of yours, how unbiased can you be?
Sure.
And we're all human, and that's difficult. And that's if you're the one who is evaluating. If you're being evaluated or peer reviewed, uh, that's even more tricky because now you're being
Mhm.
critiqued, you're being criticized, and we're all human beings.
Yeah.
And as physicians, we do take pride in what we do and how we do it. And just being told that you can improve upon something or being critiqued is not always taken positively.
Yeah. So that's even part of the system, right? Of how peer review can be improved is how, how can you remove that bias? How can you take out these sort of very personal and difficult to untangle relationships? Because this might be my partner or my competitor that I'm being reviewed by or that I'm reviewing, right? How do we sort of knowing that, like, how can we mitigate that, right? And that might mean doing more external or independent reviews. It also might mean training the reviewer on how to give constructive feedback, right?
Mhm.
Versus something that, because this is always going to be hard, right? Getting some kind of feedback. So I think these are all system changes that could be considered and
A
should be.
100%. I
Yeah.
definitely agree with you. There are multiple layers to this, and there are multiple biases that we need to be working towards eliminating. And one of them is knowing who you are evaluating or potentially knowing. And that can go either way. If it's a colleague of yours, you probably don't want to give an unfavorable opinion. But if it's a competitor of yours, you might be a little bit too harsh. So it
Mm,
goes both ways.
yeah,
And yeah, it's multi-layered, and we need to be working towards this. But yes, one of them is really, as you said, training and getting the environment that would facilitate that person not to be biased.
that's great. Well, bias is a really interesting word, and some you bring up bias specifically in your article, and I'd love to unpack some of that, right? So,
Yeah.
there's multiple types of biases that am I using the right word, that you're using
Yeah.
or that you're pointing to.
Yeah.
What are those?
So honestly, Jared, there are so many types of biases, or let's call them cognitive biases. And the two that I was stressing upon in my article that I think are relevant to clinical peer review are the outcome bias and the hindsight bias.
Mm,
And those two, I think, are very common when it comes to a process of clinical peer review, or even things that are related to this, like mortality and morbidity or root cause analysis. We have to be cognizant of those. And it's a very tricky topic because just being aware of it or talking about it is not enough to eliminate it. We have to
mm.
be really doing more. And that's why it kind of came in the article and was connected uh, to the discussion of part of it.
That's great. Well, so let's unpack some of these. What is hindsight bias? Just to kind of pick one. What is that? And for those who don't know, and
Yeah, yeah. And honestly, Jared, if you talk about any cognitive bias, generally the easiest way to describe it is a subjective reality. And if I'm gonna talk about the hindsight bias in particular, let me actually give you an example that I go through almost every other week. That's the easiest way for me to
perfect.
actually just describe it. I have a cousin that I'm really close with, and he's kind of an IT marketing kind of guy, but really into stocks and cryptocurrency. And every now and then, when I'm talking to him over the phone, he would say something. He would like mention a stock or like a coin and say, "I think it's gonna double." He's like, "Husam, I think it's gonna double." And he'll go on and on. He's like, I looked at the company and I looked at this and I looked at the chart, and he'll be talking about how he's very sure it's going to double. Granted, Jared, he doesn't buy or invest into the specific stock or the specific coin. Fast forward like 2 or 3 weeks, it actually doubles. And he will always say the same thing to me. He would say, I knew it. I swear I knew it. And in my head, I'm like, you could not have truly known this because if you did, you would have invested in it. And it's such a tricky concept because really the way I would talk about hindsight bias is knowing the outcome. Knowing now that you know the outcome, it makes you exaggerate the likelihood of having known the event beforehand.
Okay, so
Yeah.
something bad happened. Now I'm being reviewed, but they know the outcome. So knowing that as they're looking through the medical record and what happened, they're what does that look like? So how's the hindsight bias playing out there?
Right. Let's say a patient comes in and you're doing a lot of tests or a lot of imaging, and in a day or two about outcome happens. Then I'm reviewing this and I look at the outcome and I'm like, wow, this patient passed away. Then I look back at the events, and now because I know the outcome, I would probably exaggerate, or I would have this delusion that I would have known that this happened.
Mhm,
And I would be looking at the labs. I'm like, oh, you see, this was a little bit high. Had I seen this, I would have known that the outcome would be bad.
mhm.
And that's really easy because I'm looking at things in retrospect.
Yeah.
But this is not how clinical practice happens. You,
Mm.
we don't look at things in retrospect. We looked at things in foresight.
Mhm.
And that's the tricky aspect of it is this delusional clarity we get as we look at things in retrospect that yes, I would have known, I would have um, expected that to happen.
Yeah, and I can see how that would then lead into reinforcing a peer review process that feels punitive when there's a lot of, Monday morning quarterback, type of,
Yeah,
hindsight bias. And this
yeah,
is really, related and tied to outcome bias as well, right? Knowing what the outcome was.
sure.
You do kind of point to that as another type of bias.
Yeah, and it's as I said, it's really tricky because the differences are a little bit subtle. But when we talk about outcome bias, is the simple fact that you do know the outcome, it makes you judge the whole process. So instead of looking at the process, looking at how A led to B, led to C, led to D, instead of evaluating that part, you would look at the outcome and say, wow, I had a bad outcome. So this process must have been really bad.
Mm,
So you're not evaluating how you got to the outcome objectively, but rather looking back at it and judging it solely by knowing the outcome.
interesting.
And the point I really want to bring up, Jared, because this might not be very clear, is those are really unconscious things that we do. It's you don't go into a case and saying, "I want to have outcome bias," or "I want to have this type of bias." This is not how it happens. It's really unconscious, and a lot of times we're not aware of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a really hard thing to do is overcome
Yeah,
our bias of knowing what happened
yeah.
and then being able to change our approach. So have you seen or are you suggesting any solutions to any of these things? How are others approaching solutions or have you, do you have any suggestions for those listening?
Yeah, we in that article we really did not want to just bring up the problem. We really wanted to also brainstorm and think of solutions. Some of the
Right.
things that we came up with and actually have been really supported in the literature is one of them is blinding the outcomes. And the way it happens is you're given a case to evaluate, but you don't really know the outcome. So it could have been just a really good outcome, or nothing bad did happen, or it could be a bad outcome, obviously. But as you blind the outcome, you're really forcing the person who's evaluating to go through the clinical scenario the same way it happens in real life, step by step,
Yeah.
without knowing how things are going to pan out. And in every step, you actually evaluate, you see where you're at, am I on the right track? Because that's how we practice. So planning the outcome would force people to go into the foresight mode rather than the hindsight mode.
It's interesting that you say that because we do blind reviews here, and it absolutely plays out that way. It's the reviewer's like, well, this all looks pretty good. There's nothing that sort of jumped out, right? And then all of a
Yeah,
sudden, they'll find out, oh, and then the patient died at the end of this.
yeah,
And then it's like, oh,
yeah,
okay, all right. Well, now knowing that, it's just really fascinating to watch the
right,
the change in problem solving,
yeah,
posture and things like that once they know the outcome.
right. And I honestly wish more people did it that way, Jared, because it really changes things and it will help overall preserve that quality. Because if it becomes a process where we're just pointing fingers, nothing is
Mm,
going to happen.
yeah.
But if we're doing it for the quality improvement aspect of it, I think we will improve.
I
So
might suggest to risk managers and others who are listening to this and patient safety quality people, try peeling off a percentage of your peer reviews today if you're not doing it already and doing them as blind reviews,
mhm,
or take a percentage that you've done in the last year and run those back through a peer review process, maybe using completely different people or outside resources, and just see if you're getting different data points and different conclusions from that. It might help calibrate how much of these different types of biases are just affecting your system in general, right?
Yeah. And I think, Jed, the other thing is just to kind of go off of that point is most of the institutions that I looked into do clinical peer review only when a bad outcome happens.
Mhm.
This is really dangerous because how many times do we as physicians make a bad decision or an unwise decision, but we get lucky and there's no bad outcome and we just luck out.
Great point.
And yeah, and if we're really not evaluating uh, cases without a bad outcome, we might miss those specific instances that can later become a bad outcome in another case. And that's why I really hope organizations would get more engaged in not only focused clinical peer review, but the ongoing part of it. Is take cases where nothing bad happened, where it was a good patient admitted, felt better, went home. Sometimes you might be able to pick up on something that could have potentially been dangerous and avoid that happening in other cases.
Every malpractice carrier that's listening to this right now is beating this drum and thrilled to hear this because they're usually at the end of the line after bad things have happened, right? Now
Yeah.
that they're running with claims and lawsuits and things like that.
Mm.
But what if there were better systems further upstream that were really aimed at not just when bad things happen, but you know accounting for when they're not happening and when there's just, when we're just getting lucky.
Yeah.
So really, really, really great points.
Right. Yeah.
Well, we talked about how, by the way, is there any other potential solutions that you want to highlight now? I obviously will link to your article for those folks who want to hear, but anything else top of mind for you?
I mean, one other thing that I was also thinking about is just as we eliminate biases, I think the first step is getting an unbiased reviewer.
Hmm.
And by unbiased, no personal connection, uh, no financial advantages to reviewing. Obviously, physicians will always be compensated when they review a case, but in certain cases, the way they're really reimbursed can push them in a certain direction. So just having this controlled environment of the reviewer of the reimbursement can probably help the process overall.
We have depending on the review type, we use standard language with our reviewers that just helps couch them in what's really helpful here, right?
Mhm.
And for example, one of those language types is this physician is not being indicted. This is not punitive. This process and this particular review, the most helpful review is just what is the actual observational facts of what happened, what's the good, what's the bad, right?
Right.
And in being able to create a balanced sort of view, and not trying to sway one way or the other, just an actual honest clinical assessment. And because in our cases, at least the reviewers don't know each other and
Yeah.
we don't have that bias component, it's a pretty liberating process to be able to come in and go, okay, let me just look at this
Yeah.
and assess. And because it's two peers, that also helps too, right? Making sure that, if you're being reviewed, it's somebody that you would respect. It's like, if you were reviewing your peer, what kind of helpful review would you provide to them? That's kind of what your expectation would be getting back, right? And if you can make those things work, I think it's a pretty magical combination. We do a lot of technology here. I don't know if you have any opinions on what technology's role is in peer review, but have you considered it? Is there anything there?
Slightly. I think I haven't really considered that till COVID hit us.
Hmm.
And if I'm gonna give COVID any, if I'm gonna give it
Any
a
silver
real
lining?
any silver lining, truly, is how it normalized using things like Zoom or virtual meetings, and even like us today, Jared. Like you're somewhere on the West Coast, I'm somewhere on the East Coast, and we're still having this conversation. I don't think this was as common before COVID.
Yeah.
And it is time we move towards solutions like this, because if we're going to limit ourselves within our own environment, within our like 10-mile radius, how much resources can we really get versus when you can really reach anyone in the country and get the resources they have. So I think if we start utilizing those resources more, that would help eliminate bias. This would eliminate, get a more objective sense of this process. And probably hospitals can really uh, benefit overall because they're not having to limit it to their staff or to the availability of the committee that they have. But if they start utilizing other resources, I think we might get better outcome.
I think that's right. I mean, technology now has at least offered the ability to democratize access to um, experience and specialty wherever it is in the world, right? And in knowing that, my current staff may be overloaded and they've got all the things that we're requiring of them, and we've got, revenue,
Mm.
goals and all these other things, to burden them with a system that already feels either punitive or a waste of time is just, it's just not a great combination. But if we are democratizing access and we really can get the best minds on our peer reviews, and that mind happens to be on the other side of the country, but they have the capacity and the willingness and the ability to engage and thoughtfully engage, that presents all kinds of interesting opportunities for us, right? So I do think you're right. I think COVID, if it has a silver lining, it normalized um, this virtual sort of ability. But we'll have to see as time goes on how much it continues to help. I'm seeing AI come in and
Yeah.
finally um, becoming viable and capable in certain areas as far as just like streamlining processes and organizing records for sort of quick consumption and things like that. But I think as technology matures, we're going to see some of these things continue to kind of come into the workflows to make this general concept of the democratization of experience start to help us more. Any closing thoughts that you've got? I mean, what happens if peer review doesn't change?
Ah, wow, that's a really sad thought. it's I truly wish it does change. If it remains the same, I think we'll be just losing a really precious uh, resource for physicians, for patients, for the overall healthcare system. Because if we keep waiting on a bad outcome to happen, and once it happens, we have no good way in really eliminating the biases to judge it, what does that say about our ability to prevent those from happening again? What does this say about doctors who end up getting caught up in litigation and medical malpractice suits? How about residents who are still learning and they really need the valuable feedback so they can improve their practice and become the best doctors they can become? And all of those things we're not going to get if we're getting committees that are not efficient, that they're not living up to their potential, and are only slightly involved uh, in that process. So I really hope it does change because there's no other better way of changing those
Yeah,
things.
if it doesn't, it's the biggest missed opportunity
True.
uh, at our fingertips. I will say this, we do a lot of here at Medplace, we do a lot of peer reviews, but we do a lot of case reviews for medical malpractice claims. So something bad happened, right? Now it's turned into a claim, and now
Right.
this claim or the suit is hanging over the head of a physician who really did everything right, had the best intentions, but this is medicine, and bad things are going to happen. And now, I'm under this existential threat of these things going on, and it's a really hard place to be. And what I've noticed is that our reviewers, who are also just peers of these individuals, they're practicing physicians and nurses, doing it a long time, and they'll do these reviews and they'll help kind of assess these cases. And every single one of them says, because I've done that, I practice better medicine myself.
Right.
Because I'm looking critically but fairly at my peers, and we're really looking at each other, inevitably they go back to practicing better medicine, documenting in better ways, right? And so it's a great environment if you can create the environment and the culture for it, for providers of all kinds to level up and continue to level up by learning from each other.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think in medicine, if you practice medicine, you never stop learning, and it's a continuous learning curve. And reviewing someone else's work does make you reflect on your own practice and uh, how you judge things, how you document. So I agree with you, Jared. I think it's a really exciting opportunity to be part of.
That's great. Well, Dr. Brady, I want to thank you for joining me. Is there any way that we'll link to your article here in the show notes? Is there any thing that you want to mention as far as how people might want to find you if they want to reach out to you? Are you on LinkedIn or are you on other places?
I definitely LinkedIn. I can send you my LinkedIn
Great.
profile.
Well,
I'll just to update it because it's. I think I'll have to update it a little bit, but I will send it to you.
perfect. Well, we'll make sure that we put any way that you'd like to be contacted into the show notes for people to reach you. And in the meantime, appreciate you joining us. And for everyone else, thank you for listening to Reimagining Healthcare, a new dialogue with risk and patient safety leaders podcast. Again, subscribe and share if you found this valuable in this episode. If you'd like to participate in a guest, hey, maybe this is a call to arms. Anyone who's particularly proud of their peer review process, that's been listening to this and thinking, what, we've really been intentional about these issues and others. Reach out. I'd love to hear your story and tell your story here, because this is really, if we're going to change these systems for the better, it's really who's at the vanguard of pushing for these changes that's important. So again, if you're interested in speaking on this subject, you can reach out to us at speakers@medplace.com. And of course, we'll share the link and everything else for Dr. Bader's peer review article as well. But again, Dr. Bader, it was a pleasure. This was just such a great session. Thank you for unpacking this for us.
Likewise. Thank you for having me, Jared.
Fantastic. All right. Well, we'll talk soon.
Absolutely. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.